Solomon Sea, north of New Guinea. 14th of November 1942, 11:04. The air was a shimmering bowl of heat, thick enough to drink. Inside the plexiglass nose of the Lockheed Hudson, Flying Officer Bluey Johnston pressed his sweat-soaked forehead against the cool transparency, his eyes scanning the impossible blue canvas below. Contact, starboard 10 degrees. The voice of his navigator, Sergeant Ken Miller, crackled through the headset. Bluey's stomach tightened. He banked the twin-engined bomber, the right cyclone engines thrumming a deep, vibrating bass note that you felt in your teeth. There it was. Not a warship, but something just as vital. A 4,000-ton Maru, a Japanese merchant vessel, low in the water and pushing a fat white wake toward Leh. It was alone, astray from a larger convoy, but it was bristling with defenses. "Right, lads." Bluey's voice was drier than he wanted. "Let's give 'em hell." The Hudson, A-16-112, was a sturdy, reliable machine. It was designed as an American airliner, a gentle creature of peace. Now, in the desperate, sprawling fight for New Guinea, the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, was using it for everything. Submarine patrols, transport, reconnaissance, and, most agonizingly, bombing. "Bomb doors open," Bluey called, leveling out at 7,000 feet. The standard procedure. "Steady, steady." Miller was over the bomb site. The Maru was aware. Tiny black smudges appeared around the aircraft, puffs of anti-aircraft fire. The percussive thump, thump, thump of the explosions rattled the airframe. Now, bombs gone. Bluey held the plane steady for a few agonizing seconds, then broke hard to port, diving to escape the thickening flak. The co-pilot, Shorty Evans, craned his neck, looking back. "Miss!" Shorty spat the word. "Short by 50 yards. They're turning, Bluey." All of them. The 4 250-pound bombs had sent up pristine white columns of water, a perfectly useless salute. Below, the Maru's gunners, now fully alert, had found their range. Tracers like angry red hornets zipped past the cockpit. "Right!" Bluey grit his teeth. "Plan B, let's wake 'em up." He pushed the nose down, firewalling the throttles. The engine screamed in protest as the Hudson dove from the relative safety of the sky toward the lethal chaos of the sea. This was the part he hated. This was the part that was failing. "Turret, nose guns, give 'em the business." The Hudson was armed, but it was armed for defense, not attack. The dorsal turret whined as the gunner spun it, his twin 303 Brownings opening up with their distinctive rapid brrrt. In the nose, Miller wrestled with the single, flexible 303, firing short, ineffective bursts. They roared over the Maru at just 200 feet. Bluey could see the enemy sailors, their faces turned up, frantically working the deck guns. The sound of their own guns was a hollow reassurance against the sharp crack, crack, crack of shells impacting their own aircraft. The bullets from their 303s, rifle caliber, unarmored, did little more than chip the paint and inconvenience the crew. They sparked uselessly against the ship's steel hull and gun shields. It's like throwing bloody pebbles," the turret gunner yelled over the intercom, his voice a mix of fury and fear. A heavy caliber shell punched through the starboard wing, shearing a control line. The plane lurched violently. "I'm hit! Rudder's sloppy!" Bluey fought the yoke, his knuckles white. "Get us out, Shorty! Full power!" They limped away, the Maru shrinking behind them, still steaming defiantly toward Leh. The air in the cockpit was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone. Bluey Johnston's crew was lucky. They were alive. But as they nursed the crippled bomber back toward the dirt strip at Milne Bay, the feeling wasn't relief. It was a cold, bitter, and familiar frustration. They had risked everything and achieved nothing. Allied Airfield, Milne Bay, New Guinea, 14th November 1942, 16:30. The air war in the Southwest Pacific in late 1942 was a war of desperation. It was a make-do conflict, fought at the end of the world's longest supply line with second-string equipment and an abundance of courage. The focal point was New Guinea, a primordial fortress of jagged mountains, impenetrable jungle, and malarial swamps. The Japanese, having swept across the Pacific, were now dug in on the northern coast, intent on capturing Port Moresby on the south. If Moresby fell, Australia itself would be under direct threat. Holding the line was a scattered, weary, and critically under-equipped collection of Australian and American forces. The RAAF's workhorse was the Lockheed Hudson. It was a beautiful aircraft, but it was a converted passenger plane. It had range, it was reliable, and its crews loved it. But it was not a Predator. Squadron Leader Davies, commander of No. 6 Squadron RAAF, watched Bluey Johnston shot up Hudson taxi to a stop. The ground crew, men in sweat-stained khaki shorts, their faces gaunt from heat and poor rations, swarmed it. Davies's face was a mask of controlled anger. "Report, flying officer," he said, not waiting for Johnston to climb down. "She's a pig, sir," Bluey said, wiping grease and blood from his face. The blood was from a small cut from shattered plexiglass. "Flak damage to the starboard elevator and rudder. We didn't scratch him. The Maru just sailed on." Davies nodded, his jaw tight. He'd heard this story, or a variation of it, a dozen times in the last 2 weeks. The central problem was tactical. The Japanese were masters of seaborne resupply. Every night, barges, destroyers, and fast merchant ships, the Tokyo Express in the Solomons and its equivalent here, darted into ports like Leh and Buna, offloading troops, ammunition, and food. The Allies had to stop this. High-level bombing was proving wildly inaccurate against small maneuvering ships. Dive bombing was a job for dedicated aircraft like the Dauntless, which the RAAF didn't have in theater. The only option left was low-level attack, and the Hudson simply wasn't built for it. "Our 303s, sir," Johnston continued, his voice low and bitter. "They're a joke. We're asking rifle bullets to stop a ship. They're not even making the gunners duck." The problem was physics. A .303 caliber round, the same used in the infantry's Lee Enfield rifle, had nowhere near the kinetic energy to penetrate a ship's plating, a gun shield, or even a well-placed stack of sandbags. The Japanese, knowing this, had begun to pile on 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft cannons, turning their supply ships into floating fortresses. The Hudsons would fly in low, get torn to ribbons by the heavy flak, and inflict only superficial damage in return. It was a losing trade. Morale was crumbling under the weight of this futility. The crews were brave, but they weren't suicidal. They were being asked to fight a steel monster with a pea shooter, and the monster was winning. Davies looked at the holes in the Hudson's aluminum skin. "Get to debrief and see the doc about that cut." He turned and walked toward the humid, canvas-walled tent that served as his office. The stakes were simple. If they couldn't stop the Japanese supply lines, the infantry on the Kokoda track and at the beachheads would be overwhelmed. And if they kept sending Hudsons in on these spitball runs, he wouldn't have a squadron left in a month. Off the coast of Buna, New Guinea, 18th of November 1942, 09-22. The routine had become a grim ritual. "2 barges, sir, tucked in tight to the beach." Flight Lieutenant Pierce's crew, flying A-16-125, had found their target. 2 large motorized landing barges were nestled against the shore near Buna, hidden under camouflage netting. They were precisely the kind of target they were meant to eliminate. "Right," Pierce said, his voice tight. "We'll go in from the east, sun at our backs. Give them everything." They came in on the deck, their propellers chewing the humid air just 50 feet above the jungle canopy. They burst over the beach, and the world exploded. The Japanese weren't stupid. They had anticipated this. The barges were a trap. Hidden in the tree line were at least 4 heavy machine gun nests, and worse, a 20mm cannon. Pierce's Hudson was stitched from nose to tail before the crew even had time to react. Tracers filled the cockpit. The port engine, hit dead on, tore itself from its mountings in a ball of fire and black smoke. The last transmission from A-16-125 wasn't a word. It was a sharp, surprised intake of breath, then static. The other Hudson in the flight, flown by a young sergeant pilot, watched in horror as his leader's aircraft cartwheeled into the jungle, disintegrating in a massive, blossoming orange fireball. The sergeant yanked his own plane up, his bomb still in the bay, and fled, tracers chasing him until he was a dot in the sky. Milne Bay Airfield, 18th of November, 1942, 12:45. The failure was total. The remaining pilot's report was thin, shocked, and brief. The barges were untouched. Pierce and his 3 crewmen were gone. That afternoon, the mood in the mechanic's hangar, a stifling, open-sided structure of corrugated iron and palm logs, was poisonous. The men worked, but their movements were sullen. They were patching up bullet holes, knowing they were just sending the next crew out to collect more. 4 more, Jack. Flight Sergeant Jack Spanner Riley didn't look up from the engine cowling he was riveting. He just grunted. He was the NCO in charge of A Flight's maintenance. He was a man in his late 30s, wiry and tough, with hands permanently stained by grease. He'd been a mechanic on a massive cattle station in the Queensland outback, where you either fixed a broken machine with a bit of wire and a hammer, or you walked 100 miles. He didn't talk much, and he had no patience for things that didn't work. 4 more, his corporal, Davo Davidson, repeated, throwing a spanner into a toolbox with a clang. Pierce, Smithy, young Thompson, all of them. And for what? 2 bloody barges that are probably unloaded by now. Jack tightened a bolt, his knuckles scraping against the hot metal. Get me the new manifold, Davo. What's the point, Spanner? Davo kicked a fuel drum. We patch them, they fly them, they get shot to pieces. It's just waste. Jack finally stopped. He stood up straight, his blue eyes, set in a sun-scorched face, fixed on the younger man. The point, Corporal, is that the pilot of this aircraft is flying it tomorrow. Our job is to make sure the donks keep turning, the flaps work, and the holes are patched. Their job is to fly it. Don't you worry about the point. But as Davo stalked off, Jack Riley looked at the rows of .303 ammunition casings littering the floor plate. He picked one up. It was small, light, and pathetic. He thought of the 20mm cannon shell they'd pulled out of another Hudson's fuselage last week. A thick, heavy piece of high-explosive steel. Davo was right. It was a waste. They were sending good men and his good machines into a fight they couldn't win. The routine was broken. This wasn't maintenance. It was just delaying the inevitable. The frustration that had been simmering in him for weeks began to harden into something else. An idea. Milne Bay Airfield, scrap pile, 18th of November, 1942, 17. Jack Riley wasn't an engineer, he wasn't a pilot, he was a spanner turner. But where an engineer saw blueprints and stress tolerances, Jack saw problems and solutions. In the outback, if your tractor broke, you didn't wait for a part from Brisbane. You took a part from the harvester, beat it into shape, and made it fit. He walked away from the hangar, toward the graveyard at the edge of the strip. This was where the wrecks were towed, a boneyard of shattered aircraft that were beyond repair, cannibalized for parts. He stood in front of the carcass of an American P-40 Kitty Hawk. It had nosed over on landing. The pilot had walked away, but the airframe was a write-off. Jack stared at the wings. Protruding from the leading edge were the barrels of its armament, 50 caliber Browning machine guns. He walked over and ran his grease-stained hand over the thick, heavy barrel of the outboard gun. He thought of the .303 casing in his pocket. Then he looked at the 50 cal's ammunition belt, still partially fed into the breech. The cartridges were as thick as his thumb, the projectile a heavy slug of hardened steel. This was not a pebble. This was a hammer. He looked from the P-40 wreck back toward the flight line, where a Hudson sat silhouetted against the setting sun. The Hudson had a smooth, rounded plexiglass nose. It was designed for a navigator with a map, not a gunner with a weapon. But what, Jack thought, what if it wasn't? He paced back to his hangar, past Squadron Leader Davies, who was smoking a cigarette and staring into the jungle, his face a mask of worry. Jack walked straight to the A-16-112, Bluey Johnston's plane, the one that had been shot up 4 days prior. It was almost ready to fly again. He stood in front of its nose. The clear panels gave a perfect view, but they were fragile, useless. He pictured ripping the plexiglass out, stripping the navigator's station, reinforcing the bulkhead, and then mounting, not 1, but 4 of those 50 calibers from the P-40, fixed, all pointing forward. The navigator wouldn't need to aim, the pilot would. The pilot would point the whole plane. He remembered driving his utility truck back on the station, chasing feral camels. He'd mounted a spotlight on the roof to daze them, and a rifle in a vise on the dashboard to hit them. You just drove straight at them. This was the same. You didn't bomb the barges. You didn't shoot at them from a turret. You drove the plane right at them and hit them with a wall of steel. He knew, instantly, that it would work. He also knew that every officer, every engineer, and every by-the-book man on the base would say it was impossible, that it would ruin the aerodynamics, that the recoil would tear the frame apart, that it was, in the language of the Ray AF, just not on. He didn't care. He stubbed out his hand-rolled cigarette. He knew how to bolt metal to metal. He knew how to make it strong, and he knew where to get the guns. Milne Bay, Squadron HQ, 19 November 1942, Hydro 7:15. Squadron leader Davies was drinking his morning coffee, a bitter sludge made from reheated grounds. He was trying to draft the telegram to Flight Lieutenant Pierce's family. He looked up as Jack Riley entered the tent, cap in hand. "Flight Sergeant." "What is it? Is 112 not ready?" "She's ready, sir," Jack said. His voice was flat, practical. "I'm here about something else. I'm here about why Mr. Pierce's plane went down." Davies put his pencil down. "And what would you know about that, Riley?" The tone was sharp. "I know it's 'cause our guns are useless, sir, begging your pardon. We're fighting steel with lead. It's not working." "I am acutely aware of our limitations, Sergeant," Davies said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I don't need my maintenance NCO to tell me." "No, sir," Jack pressed on, undeterred. "But I can fix it. Or I think I can." Davies leaned back, intrigued despite himself. Riley was his best mechanic. He wasn't a complainer. "Go on." "There's a wrecked P-40 in the boneyard, sir. 650 cals in the wings. I want to take 4 of them. For spare parts. We don't have any aircraft that use them." "No, sir. I want to put them in the nose of a Hudson." Davies stared at him. He thought he'd misheard. "You want to, what?" "Rip out the plexiglass nose, sir. The nav station. Build a new bulkhead, reinforced. Mount 4 50 cals, fixed forward, linked to a trigger on the pilot's yoke. The pilot aims the whole aircraft. We turn it into a strafer, a gunship." There was a long, heavy silence. The only sound was a fly buzzing against the canvas wall. "Riley," Davies said slowly, "do you have any idea what you're talking about? You're a mechanic. You're not an aeronautical engineer. The recoil from 450 caliber guns, it could shatter the airframe. It would throw the center of gravity so far off it would be unflyable. It's madness. The P-40's wings don't shatter, sir, and they're light. We're talking about the main fuselage bulkhead. It can take it. I can make it take it. And the aerodynamics? Ripping the nose off a plane? We'll build a new one, sheet metal. It might not be pretty, but it'll be strong. It'll be less drag than the turret, I reckon." "This is not a Queensland cattle station, Riley. You can't just bolt a new part onto a King's aircraft." Davies stood up, his frustration boiling over. "This is a $300,000 machine. It's a Lockheed design. It's not a Ute. Your job is to fix them, not redesign them." Jack Riley stood his ground. He met the officer's eyes. "Sir, with respect, your job is to stop those barges, and you're not. This will. I know it will. All I'm asking for is A-16 1 and 12. She's already patched up. She's due for a test flight anyway. Give me and my lads 48 hours. And a pilot who's willing." Davies looked past Riley, out the tent flap, at the oppressive green steam bath of a jungle. He thought of the telegram on his desk. He thought of the smug, untouched Maru that Johnston had described. He thought of the fireball that had been Pierce's crew. What was worse, losing a plane in a crackpot experiment, or losing one, then another, in a routine that was proven to fail? "You're mad, Riley. You're completely barking mad," Davies said. He ran a hand over his exhausted face. "You get the guns. You get your 48 hours. But if this thing so much as shudders on the ground test, I'll have you on a charge so fast your head will spin. And this conversation never happened. Do you understand me, Flight Sergeant?" "Yes, sir," Jack said. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Thank you, sir." He turned and walked out, already making a list in his head. Davo, Titch Hogan for the riveting, and Sparky Jones for the wiring, and he needed the best cutters on the base. Milne Bay, A Flight Hangar, 19th of November 1942, 19:00. "You want to do what?" Corporal Davo Davidson stared at Jack, his jaw hanging open. "You heard me. Get the oxyacetylene torch. We're cutting the nose off on 12. The hangar was a hive of frantic, secretive activity. Under the harsh glare of two bare bulbs, Jack's hand-picked team, his Outback engineers as they'd be called later, descended on the unsuspecting Hudson. The work was brutal, hot, and heavy. The first step was destructive. Davo and Titch Hogan, wearing dark goggles, cut into the aircraft's elegant nose. The sound of the torch was a sharp, hissing whoosh, and the smell of burning paint and molten aluminum filled the humid night air. The plexiglass and its delicate framework were torn out, leaving a gaping, ragged hole where the navigator's station had been. "Looks like a bloody shark bit it, Jack," Titch said, wiping sweat from his face. "It's about to be," Jack replied. "Now the bulkhead." This was the structural genius of Riley's idea. He wasn't just bolting guns to a thin sheet of metal. He scrounged a thick steel plate from a wrecked Stuart tank, a piece of armor designed to stop shells. Using the torch, they cut it to fit inside the Hudson's fuselage, just behind the new opening. "It's too heavy, Spanner," Davo yelled over the din of riveting hammers. "She'll be nose heavy. She'll never get off the dirt." "She will," Jack yelled back. "We're taking the turret out." "The turret? But what about defense?" "Defense is flying home. We're taking out the turret, the hydraulics, and all that .303 ammo. That's, what, 400 pounds? More? It'll balance." This was a gamble, a gut instinct calculation. For the next 36 hours, they worked without sleep. They were mechanics, fitters, and electricians, all improvising. They built a heavy-duty rack, bolting it directly to the new steel bulkhead and the main fuselage spars. This rack would hold the 450 caliber Brownings, salvaged under cover of darkness from the P-40. "Sparky," Jack called to his electrician. "I need 'em to fire together, from the yoke, like the Kitty Hawk." "Right, boss." Sparky, a kid from Sydney, jury-rigged a new electrical system, splicing wires and installing a heavy-duty solenoid switch. He connected it to the red bomb release button on the pilot's control yoke. The final piece was the new nose cone. They didn't have time for aerodynamics. They beat, bent, and riveted sheets of aluminum duralumin into a blunt, ugly, utilitarian cone. It was less a piece of an aircraft and more a piece of agricultural machinery. 4 holes were cut in the front, just large enough for the thick barrels of the Brownings to poke through. By the morning of November 21st, A-16-112 was no longer a Hudson. It was something else. It was squat, aggressive, and brutal-looking. The sleek lines were gone, replaced by a snout that bristled with menace. The ground crew gathered around it, silent. "My God, Jack," Davo whispered, awestruck. It's a bloody porcupine." The name stuck. Milne Bay, firing range, 21st November, 1942, 11:30. They towed the porcupine to the edge of the airfield, to a makeshift range used for testing turret guns. The target was a collection of empty fuel drums and the rusted-out hulk of a Japanese truck captured during the battle for the bay. Squadron leader Davies was there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Bluey Johnston, the pilot who had volunteered for this, stood beside him, chewing on a piece of grass. Jack Riley was in the cockpit, running the final checks on the firing circuits. "Right," Davies called out. "If this thing shakes itself to bits, I'm holding you personally responsible, Riley." "Understood, sir." Jack climbed out, giving Bluey a nod. "She's all yours, flying officer. Just give 'em short bursts." Bluey hauled himself into the pilot's seat. The cockpit felt different. The familiar navigator's table was gone, replaced by a dark metal wall. In front of him, through the windscreen, he could see the 4 black muzzles protruding from the new metal nose. He started the engines. The Hudson shuddered to life, the props kicking up a cloud of red dust. "Testing guns!" Bluey's voice crackled over the field radio. He lined up the aircraft's nose with the wrecked truck, about 200 yards away. He put his thumb on the red button on the yoke. He took a deep breath and pressed it. The sound was not a burt. It was a roar. A deafening, apocalyptic thump, 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 thump that was more of a physical concussion than a noise. It was the sound of 4 heavy-caliber guns, firing at over 800 rounds per minute each, right in front of the cockpit. The entire aircraft, all 10 tons of it, visibly shuddered on its landing gear. The noise ripped across the airfield, a sound no one there had ever heard. It was as if a giant was tearing sheets of calico, but more terrifying was the result. The stream of tracers, 4 converging lines of white-hot light, wasn't a stream. It was a fire hose. It hit the derelict truck, and the truck didn't just get holes in it, it disintegrated. Pieces of metal were blasted into the air. The fuel drums behind it vaporized in a flash. Bluey held the trigger for 3 seconds. When he released it, the silence that fell was profound, broken only by the idling of the engines and the ringing in everyone's ears. The truck was gone. Where it had been, there was only smoking, torn earth. Bluey's voice came over the radio. It was shaky. Bloody hell. Jack Riley let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at the nose of the Hudson. The rivets were all still in place. The metal cone was smoking, but it was intact. Squadron Leader Davies slowly uncrossed his arms. He walked over to Jack, his eyes wide. He didn't yell. He didn't congratulate him. He just looked at the smoking remains on the range, then back at the Porcupine. He clapped Jack on the shoulder, hard. "Right," Davies said, his voice hoarse. "Build another one. Solomon Sea, off the Huon Gulf, 23 November 1942, 14:12. The Porcupine felt different. Bluey Johnston could feel the extra weight in the nose. It was sluggish on the controls, and he needed more trim. But the 2 Wright Cyclones had the power. He flew with a co-pilot and 2 gunners, one in the belly, one in the open hatch where the turret used to be, both armed with Vickers K guns just in case. For 2 hours they flew a search pattern, the air thick and bumpy. Then, the call. "Smoke, sir. Dead ahead." It was a convoy, not 1 ship, but 3. 2 Maris and a destroyer escort. It was the jackpot. It was also a suicide run. "Right, lads," Bluey said over the intercom. His heart was hammering against his ribs. This was it. No bombs. No 303s, just Jack Riley's mad invention. "We're going for the escort. Cut the head off the snake." Squadron Leader Davies's last words to him. "Don't be a hero, Johnston. See if it works, and come home." "To hell with that," Bluey muttered. He pushed the nose down. They dove from 8,000 feet. The destroyer saw them coming. The sky around the Hudson was instantly filled with the black smudges of flak. The ship began a hard turn to starboard, its bow wave a brilliant white slash. 200 knots, the co-pilot yelled. 1,000 feet. Tracers were whipping past them. This was the moment of truth. In the old Hudson, this was when they'd feel helpless. 500 feet! Bluey lined up the destroyer's bridge in his simple, painted cross gun sight. His thumb moved to the red button. "Hold on," he breathed. At 300 yards, he pressed the button. The roar was even more terrifying in the air. The plane bucked. The controls vibrated so hard his vision blurred, and the cockpit filled with the acrid smell of burnt cordite. The stream of 50 caliber high explosive and armor-piercing rounds struck the destroyer like a physical hammer. It was not a ping, it was a crunch. Bluey watched, mesmerized, as the ship's bridge disintegrated. The gun shields for the forward anti-aircraft mounts were peeled back like tin foil. The steel plating, which had laughed off 303s, was shredded. He saw flashes of fire and smoke erupt all along the forward deck. He held the trigger down for 5 seconds, an eternity. He pulled up, the G-force pressing him into his seat, jinking hard to avoid the flak from the other ships. "My God! Bluey, look!" the co-pilot screamed. The destroyer was slowing. It was veering, out of control. Black smoke was pouring from its bridge and forward section. It was no longer firing. It was crippled. We did it," Bluey whispered, leveling off. "We bloody well did it." They turned for home, the adrenaline making them all laugh, a high, shaky sound. They had just taken on a Japanese destroyer in a converted passenger plane, and they had won. The war in the Pacific, for No. 6 Squadron, had just changed forever. Milne Bay Airfield, 23 November 1942, 16:45. When A-16 1 and 12 landed, it taxied straight to the debriefing tent, its metal nose cone blackened and scorched by powder burns. The ground crew was already swarming it before the engines had fully stopped. Bluey Johnston all but fell out of the cockpit. He was shaking, drenched in sweat, and grinning like a lunatic. He walked straight up to Squadron Leader Davies, who was waiting with Jack Riley. "Sir," Johnston said, his voice cracking, "it works. It's a monster. We hit the destroyer. Crippled it. It just came apart. The debriefing was electric. The co-pilot and gunners confirmed the story. The Porcupine had turned a 10-ton aircraft into a flying shotgun. The effect on morale was instantaneous. It was like a dam had broken. The frustration that had plagued the squadron for months evaporated, replaced by a hungry, aggressive confidence. "I want one," another pilot said, interrupting the debrief. "When can I get one, Spanner?" "I'm next." Suddenly, Jack Riley was the most popular man on the base. Davies, seeing the look in his pilot's eyes, made a decision. "Riley," he said, turning to the mechanic, "cancel all routine maintenance. Your team's only job, starting right now, is building more of these. Scrounge whatever you need. I want every Hudson we have converted. I'll handle the paperwork." The paperwork was a hastily written after-action report that Davies sent up the chain of command. He called it a field modification for forward-firing armament. Within 3 days, Jack's Outback engineers had converted 2 more Hudsons. They were crude, ugly, and terrifyingly effective. The pilots, no longer feeling like victims, began hunting in pairs. They developed new tactics, coming in from different angles, one plane drawing fire while the other strafed. The rumor spread to other RAAF squadrons. Pilots from number 32 Squadron, hearing the stories, flew over to Milne Bay just to see the Porcupines. Port Moresby, RAF Command HQ, 5th December 1942. Group Captain Bull Garing, a high-level operations officer, read Davies's report and the subsequent combat logs with stunned silence. 8 barges and 2 small transports, confirmed, in 1 week, by Hudsons. He tossed the report on his desk. "I thought Davies was exaggerating. Get me a transport. I'm flying to Milne Bay. I need to see this gunship for myself." When Garing arrived, Jack Riley's hangar looked less like a maintenance bay and more like a factory. They had streamlined the process. They were now fitting 650 cals in the nose. Garing, a veteran of World War I, walked around one of the converted planes, tapping the thick steel bulkhead with his cane. He looked at Jack. "This was your idea, Flight Sergeant?" "We had a problem, sir," Jack said simply. "This seemed to be the fix." Garing grunted. "This isn't a fix, Sergeant. This is a bloody revolution." A report was sent back to RAF Command in Australia and even to the Americans. The Riley modification, as it was unofficially known, became a semi-standard design. It proved beyond a doubt that a heavily armed, multi-engine aircraft attacking at low level was the key to breaking the Japanese supply chain. The desperate defensive spitball war was over. The hunt had begun. Bunagona Beachhead, January 1943. The Porcupines were evolving. Jack Riley's original design was a brilliant improvisation, but now, with dozens of missions under their belt, the crews were providing feedback. "Jack," Bluey Johnston said, back from another run, "it's a marvel, but we're having to aim high on the barges. By the time our guns are on target, we're right on top of them. We need more time." "Angled down," Jack mused, tapping a pencil on his desk. "You want the guns angled down. Just a bit. Maybe 3-4 degrees." The next Porcupine that rolled out, Mark II, had its guns canted slightly downward. Now pilots could fly level at 50 feet and pour a devastating stream of fire directly onto the decks of their targets without having to drop the plane's nose and obscure their view. Then came the bombs. With the Porcupines suppressing the anti-aircraft fire so effectively, pilots realized they could get in even closer. "Why not do both?" a pilot from number 32 Squadron suggested. "Strafe them on the way in and drop a present on the way out." This led to the perfection of a new, terrifying tactic, the strafe bomb. A Hudson, armed with its nose guns and 2 250-pound bombs, would approach a target at wave-top height. At half a mile, the pilot would open up with the 50 cals. The effect on the enemy gunners was catastrophic. They couldn't keep their heads up. The ship's defenses would be silenced by the overwhelming force. Then, as the Hudson roared over the target at 200 knots, the pilot would release his bombs. He didn't drop them, he skipped them. The bombs, fused with an 11-second delay, would hit the water, skip once or twice like a flat stone, and slam directly into the side of the maru or barge. The Hudson would be a mile away before the bombs detonated, blowing the ship's hull open at the water line. But the Japanese were not idle. They learned, and they adapted. Reports came back of porcupines facing a new, terrifying defense. The Japanese began armoring their barges with steel plates salvaged from wrecks. They stopped moving during the day, and, most lethally, they set up flak traps on shore, positioning 40mm cannons in hidden jungle emplacements to cover the shipping lanes. In late January, a two-ship flight went in after a barge near Leh. They came in low, guns blazing. But as they passed over the beach, the hidden 40mm cannons opened up. One Hudson A-16-140 was hit in the belly. It didn't explode. It just died, slamming into the water in a cloud of spray. The crews were shaken. Their new weapon wasn't invincible. The enemy was punching back. The Outback engineers had to adapt again. They began scrounging armor plate from wrecked tanks and bolting it under the pilot's seats and around the new gun bays. The Hudsons became heavier, slower, but tougher. It was a constant, brutal arms race, fought by mechanics with rivets and welders. Milne Bay, Jack Riley's workshop. 7 February 1943. Jack Riley was tired. He hadn't had a full night's sleep in 2 months. His workshop was a 24-hour operation. The Porcupine was a success, but that success had a price. The Hudsons were being flown into the teeth of the enemy's worst defenses. They were no longer just recon planes. They were the tip of the spear, and spears get broken. Losses, which had dipped when the modification was new, were beginning to creep up again. The airframes, designed for the gentle curves of civil aviation, were being subjected to stresses they were never meant to endure. Flying at 200 knots in thick tropical air, pulling high-G evasive maneuvers, and absorbing the constant pounding vibration of 6 heavy machine guns, it was tearing them apart. Jack and his team weren't just modifying planes. They were in a constant battle against metal fatigue. Rivets popped. Wing spars showed hairline fractures. Landing gear collapsed. "She's shaking herself to death, Jack," Davo told him, pointing to a crack in a main engine mount. "We're pushing them too hard." Jack knew it, but the operational tempo was relentless. Command expected success now. The moral weight was heavier. One evening, he sat on a crate sharing a smoke with a young pilot, a replacement barely 20 years old. "You're Spanner Riley, aren't you?" the kid asked, his voice full of hero worship. "The bloke who built the gun noses?" "I'm one of them," Jack said. "They're amazing, sir," the pilot said, his eyes bright. "We got a barge today. I've never seen anything like it. It just came apart. There was nothing left." Jack just nodded, smoking. He'd seen the reports. He'd seen the gun camera footage. The Porcupines were not just crippling ships. They were devastating the men on them. The sheer volume of fire was absolute. The young pilot flew his first Porcupine mission the next day. He was overconfident, taught that the guns made him invincible. He flew straight and level, holding the trigger down, and a 40mm shell from a hidden shore battery took his wing off. He and his crew were gone in an instant. Jack watched the smoke plume from miles away. He felt a cold sickness in his stomach. He had given them a sharper sword, and in doing so, he had made them the primary target. He had given them confidence, and it had made them reckless. That night, Squadron Leader Davies found him in the hangar, just staring at the new Hudson on the line, A-16-155. "It's not your fault, Jack," Davies said softly. "I built the bloody thing, sir," Jack said, his voice rough. "I'm the one painting the targets on their backs." "You gave them a chance, Jack," Davies countered. "Before you, they had no chance. They were just targets. Now they're the most feared thing in this sky. War is a hard business, Flight Sergeant. Don't you dare stop building them." Jack nodded, but the simple black and white clarity of his initial idea was gone. It had been replaced by the complex gray and bloody reality of war. Bismarck Sea, 2 or 4 March 1943. The tide had turned in New Guinea. The brutal fighting at Buna and Gona, supplied by sea, had finally ended in an Allied victory. But the Japanese were not done. They were massing for a final massive reinforcement of Leh. Intelligence reported a major convoy, 8 transports, 8 destroyers. It was the largest Japanese force yet assembled in the region. Stopping it was not just a mission, it was the mission. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was about to begin. By now, the RAF Hudsons were no longer the only strafers in the sky. The Americans, inspired by their own innovators like Pappy Gunn and by the RAF's success, had created heavily armed B-25 Mitchell bombers. The RAF itself was receiving the new purpose-built Beaufighter, a whispering death, that combined cannons and machine guns. But the Hudsons, the originals, were there. On March 3rd, they flew in as part of the massive coordinated aerial assault. They were no longer the main striking force, but they had a critical role. They flew in low, just as they had been for months, their Riley noses blazing. They targeted the destroyer escorts, just as Bluey Johnston had on that first day. Their job was to flak suppress, to hit the gun crews and the ship's bridges, silencing the anti-aircraft fire so that the higher-flying B-25s and Beaufighters could line up their skip-bombing runs. A Hudson from No. 32 Squadron roared across the deck of the destroyer Horatio. Its .650 calibers tore through the bridge and the aft gun mounts, silencing them completely. Seconds later, a B-25's bomb skipped into its side. It was a symphony of destruction, and the porcupines were a vital instrument. The battle was a catastrophe for the Japanese. All 8 transports and 4 of the destroyers were sent to the bottom. Over 3,000 Japanese troops were lost. The attempt to reinforce Leh had been utterly crushed. The back of the Japanese war effort in New Guinea was broken, and it was broken by air power, a new kind of air power, born in Jack Riley's hangar. Milne Bay, 15th April 1943. The Hudsons were being phased out, replaced by the superior Beaufighters. The war had moved on. Jack Riley stood on the airstrip as a new group captain pinned a medal to his sweat-stained khaki shirt. It was the British Empire Medal, BEM, for meritorious service and innovation in the field. Your ingenuity, Flight Sergeant Riley, the officer read from a citation, has been instrumental in turning the tide of the air war in this theater. You and your men have saved countless Allied lives. Jack just nodded, his face impassive. He looked past the officer, at the last porcupine on the line. It looked tired, battered, and obsolete. But to him, it was beautiful. Squadron Leader Davies, now promoted and being transferred, shook his hand. You did it, Jack. You crazy, stubborn bastard. You did it. The legacy was clear. The RAF's strafers, starting with Jack's Hudsons, had proven the concept. The idea of the low-level, forward-firing gunship became the dominant tactic in the Pacific. It was a strategy born of desperation, built by mechanics, and proven by pilots. Toowoomba, Queensland, Australia. 19th October 1978. The garage smelled of old oil, cold steel, and dry dust. An old wiry man with hands twisted by arthritis was meticulously rebuilding the carburetor for a Holden sedan. A young historian, clutching a tape recorder, sat on an overturned crate. Mr. Riley, the historian said, the records are patchy, but your name keeps coming up. The men from No. 6 Squadron. They called you Spanner. They said you won the war for them. Jack Riley laughed, a dry, rasping sound. No, I just fixed a problem. The pilots, Bluey Johnston Pierce, all those young lads, they won the war. I just gave them a better hammer. But the porcupine design, it was revolutionary. It's a direct ancestor of the Beaufighter and B-25 strafers, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Many say that was the turning point, and it started here, with you, in a tin shed in New Guinea. Jack stopped his work. He looked at his hands, the grease still ingrained in the creases, a lifetime later. You see a problem, he said, his voice quiet. You're a young fella. You see tactics and strategy. You know what I saw? I saw good men climbing into perfectly good aircraft and flying out to die. For nothing. Because their tools weren't right. He picked up a spanner from his bench. It wasn't about being smart. It was about being angry. Angry at the waste. You're on a station 500 miles from anywhere, and the water pump breaks. You don't write a report. You fix it. You use what you've got. We had Hudsons. We had a scrap heap. And we had an enemy. So we fixed the problem. The historian looked around the quiet, dusty garage. It was so far from the steam-green hell of New Guinea, from the roar of the cyclones and the thunder of the .50 calibers. They're all in museums now, the historian said softly. The Hudsons. Well, the ones that survived. Are they? Jack hadn't thought about one in years. Good planes. He turned back to the carburetor. The historian knew the interview was over. He packed up his recorder and left the old man to his work. History remembers the admirals, the generals, and the aces. It remembers the names of the great battles. But victory is often forged in the shadows, by the unseen and the uncelebrated. It is built by the quiet, practical, and stubborn minds of men like Jack Spanner Riley, who, when faced with an impossible problem, simply refused to accept it and went to the boneyard to find a solution. In a museum in Canberra, a restored RAF Lockheed Hudson sits in silent repose. It is not a porcupine. The gun nose modifications were too crude, too field expedient to be preserved. It wears its original, elegant, transparent nose. It looks, once again, like a gentle creature of peace. But for a few desperate, pivotal months, in the hands of angry Australian mechanics and brave pilots, it had been the most terrifying predator in the southern sky.